Hello and welcome to Hort Science Online. My name's Andrew Wilson and I'm the Technical Manager for ICL Professional Horticulture. And I'm going to talk to you about identifying plant disorders in ornamental plants and give you a few tips to help your crops and hopefully identify any problems and learn to avoid them in the future. I mean, in an ideal world, we wouldn't get deficiencies, but in the real world that they occur and they can easily be corrected in the short term, but we really need to get to the root of the problem. And there's generally a reason like water quality or a high growing media pH behind it. And if we look at this issue and try and resolve it, we can prevent it happening again in the long term. There's really two ways of diagnosing. The best way is obviously to send a sample off to a lab, but there's another way as well, which is visual diagnosis. And I'm going to talk about both methods in a bit more detail, just to give you a few tips. In terms of types of analysis, these are samples that you'd normally take and send off to a laboratory. The most common sample that we do regularly is water samples, and I'll talk about that. And then obviously growing media, sampling the substrate you're growing in. And then obviously you can do leaf samples or sap analysis, and I'll talk about that. The most important one for me really is water analysis. I do this regularly with all my growers. We check it at least once a year, and we check every source of water they have. And quite often, they have mains water or borehole water, and that can be quite hard water, can have quite high conductivity and quite high pH, but most importantly, very high alkalinity, and that has an effect on the plant quality and the availability of nutrients. And quite the converse, a lot of people are also collecting soft water now, from rainwater, and this is low in conductivity and quite low in dissolved nutrients like calcium and magnesium. So this brings up other issues. So knowing this before you start growing your crop gives you a real idea about any potential problems you might have that you might need to avoid. And when we talk about water, everybody thinks of the pH. Yeah, and the pH does have quite an effect on the availability, particularly in the growing media. And at low pHs, quite a few nutrients are poorly available, and also at high pHs, they're quite unavailable. But more important than that is to look at the alkalinity of the water, or what we call the bicarbonate, and this will tell you the effect the water is going to have on the growing media and whether it's going to cause the pH to rise and then cause you deficiency symptoms. Another analysis we do quite a lot is growing media analysis, and this tends to be done during the crop, just to follow where the nutrition is and check that the conductivity isn't too high, that the pH hasn't risen, and we've got the correct amount of nutrients there. You take samples more often if you were growing a new crop or you'd had problems in the past, but it really helps you to give a blueprint to your feeding and your nutrition program and try and avoid excesses and deficiencies of nutrients. So it gives a real picture of what's available at that particular time, and you can see how close to the track you are with your nutrients. And showing you in a bit more detail why the pH of the growing media is important. We see the blue band there, and that's really where we're trying to keep the pH somewhere between 5 and 6. It becomes a bit more difficult with peat-free growing media, which tends to be a bit higher. But if the pH does get really high, it gets above 6.5, you'll certainly start to see iron deficiency, like in the picture there of the rose. So we're trying to keep things optimum and avoid quality losses. And you mustn't get too fixed on one nutrient. It's all about the balance as well. But if iron is low, it is going to affect the plant quite dramatically. But again, too much iron will also affect the plant. So keep things in balance, but be aware of what the limiting factors are for the crop. Leaf analysis is carried out a lot, particularly in fruit crops and agriculture, and obviously for monocrops, they have a good idea of what the leaf analysis should be. For ornamental crops, it's a lot more difficult because we don't have all the data for every single crop. A grower can be growing several hundred different lines, and it's really used as a diagnosis tool if they see a problem to try and help. But it's not really reliable for iron deficiency. and it's better to use the method of looking at the crop to see what the deficiency symptom is for iron. It gives you a much better result because laboratory results are often unreliable. But obviously crops like poinsettias, they're grown a lot, quite a long-term crop, has quite a lot of associated nutritional difficulties, and they have built up quite a lot of nutritional values. So in terms of nitrogen and all the trace elements, you've got a safe range there that if you take a sample, you can see whether you're within the range. So that can be quite useful. But when you come to nursery stock, as I said, there's a whole range of species, and this table here shows you the range that you can get from taking samples across a range of different woody plants. And you see in these samples the nitrogen ranges from 6% to 2%, and the calcium ranges from 4% down to 0.7. So there's quite a dramatic difference. So, you know, it's a guide. If you were growing a crop a lot and you were trying to learn from it, obviously you could build up some data. But what this is telling you is basically what the plant has taken up, so you can see, you know, what's in the leaf. You can also use sap analysis to tell you what's being transported to, you know, around the plant to get an idea of the uptake. But again, these are just shots in time, just showing you at that moment what the situation is. So it's just a guide. So coming on to visual identification of nutrient deficiencies, you know, this is quite a practical tool, and with a bit of practice and following a few simple rules, you can get a good idea of what's going on. But don't just jump to the conclusion that it's a nutrient deficiency. Have a real close look at the crop and look at how the problem's distributed across the crop, and then you'll get an idea of whether it could be nutritional or whether it's a disease or something else, or whether it's only affecting certain varieties or certain colors of a plant. The more you look at it, the more accurate your diagnosis is going to be. And lots of symptoms like tip burns, chlorosis, which is yellowing, or necrosis, sort of brown spots on the leaves. You know, they are characteristic of nutrient deficiencies, but they can also be associated with other stresses, particularly plant disease. And often, you know, you need to look closely to see plant disease. I always say knock the plant out of the pot and look at the roots, because the plant at the bottom there, the roots look pretty healthy, but if you zoom in and have a closer look, you'll see some dead roots from Pythium, you know, and that's affecting the uptake of nutrients. The distribution of plant disease is generally not as uniform as it would be with a nutrient. You can often see a pattern of spread of a fungus across the crop, and that's often a clue. So stand back and look at the crop, look at the color of the leaves, and see if you can see differences. There's many other issues that can cause problems on the leaves, from pesticide spray, plant growth regulators, environmental factors such as frost, and even overwatering and underwatering. So, you know, I'm focusing on the nutrient deficiencies here, but just be aware, look at the crop, look at the history of the crop. You might have some experience of a crop being susceptible to powdery mildew or red spider or something, and that will give you a tip. So I'm really going to talk about nutrient mobility within the plant, and if we understand a bit about how nutrients move around the plant, you know, we can really understand what the potential deficiencies, you know, can be. So we talk about mobile elements, and these are plants that can move around the plant, and they move from older, you know, to newer tissue as the plant grows, whereas immobile ones can't. So for example, calcium is incorporated into the cell walls, so it's immobile, and it can't be relocated later. So this gives us a real clue how to find these deficiencies. So in a bit more detail, there's lots of tables you'll see that separate the deficiency effects onto the old leaves or the young leaves or the buds. And knowing a little bit about it, you know, will give you quite a lot of information. So look at the plant closely and try and establish whether it's the older leaves that are affected most, or you know, the younger tips or the younger leaves, and just have a look at a few plants. There's another diagram showing you, and you can see at the top there the line between the new growth and the old growth. And the commonest ones you'll see are iron and calcium. They both affect the tips, but I'll explain that the differences are quite different. I'll explain why. Looking at the older leaves, one of the commonest things is magnesium deficiency, and it's quite a characteristic deficiency with green veins and interveinal chlorosis between them. So let's look at it graphically and try and make it easier to understand. So immobile elements, as I said, they first show up in the newer growth because the plant can't move them from the old leaves into the new leaves. So if there's a shortage in the pot or the plant can't take it up, you'll quickly see them in the tips or the growing emerging leaves. And typically, this can be caused by iron, calcium, boron, manganese, and less common ones are copper, zinc, and sulfur. So there's still a list, but we've leveled it down a little bit and made it a little bit easier to think about what the problem might be. And here's a couple of examples. There's iron on the left. As I say, it's affecting the growing point and the new leaves. You can see the dark veins and yellow between. So that's quite a dramatic deficiency. And on the right hand side, we've got calcium deficiency. And as I said to you, it's laid down in the cell walls. So if it can't be supplied in time, the new leaves tend to go brown and curl around the edges. And this is quite characteristic. And it can be caused by lack of calcium getting to the tips. I mean, it could be caused by poor irrigation or high humidity, but the deficiency is there. Coming on to mobile elements, again, this is different. So if we look at the diagram, we see the older leaves are pale. This is because the plant, is very efficient and it can move the nutrients from the older leaves to the very important growing tips and keep them green. And there's quite a few elements that are mobile. The most important ones being nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium. Molybdenum is rarely seen, mainly only on poinsettias, but you can see there. And a couple of examples, you can see the importance of nitrogen, the effect on growth it has. If you look at the left-hand picture, we've got a healthy plant on the left, and on the right, we've got a stunted plant there, and the older leaves are very pale, and obviously the plant's struggling to grow because it hasn't got enough nitrogen. On the right-hand side, we've got phosphorus there, and we can see in the older leaves, the deficiency there showing as a sort of reddish purple colouring, and that's quite common. The plant's obviously putting a lot of demand on nutrients as it flowers, and it's really showing there in the old leaves. Just to complicate it a little bit more, some of the nutrients are seen as an interveinal chlorosis. So if you look at the diagram there, with very dark veins and pale between them. Now we've already covered immobile and mobile. So interveinal chlorosis can be seen in the new shoots and the old leaves. So the combination of these two helps you level it down a little bit more to try and understand what the problem could be. And it's typically magnesium is the commonest one, and then copper, iron, and manganese. But magnesium is very common, and you'll see it in the older leaves. And there we go, there's iron again. So it's immobile, so we're seeing interveinal chlorosis in the new growth. And just bringing in magnesium on the right, it's mobile, so we're getting the same sort of symptoms, but on the older leaves. And it's quite a clear distinction there. So if you're looking at the plant, you look at the top or the bottom of the plant, you're getting very close to what the problem could be. Another way it can present itself is on the leaf margins. We already showed the picture of the calcium affecting the poinsettia on the new growth on the edges. It can present itself in various ways and different colors in terms of purple, yellow, brown, or even red margins. And again, it can be the new or the old growth. And the commonest ones are potassium and calcium. And I'll show you the example. For potassium, potassium's mobile. So if we look at the older leaves, we can see that the edge browning has developed into necrosis all the way around the leaf. There's only a healthy green bit in the middle, but the plant has pulled the potassium out of there into the new growth. If we look on the right, this time with the primula, you can see the tips are scorched there or browning off where there's not enough potassium getting through to the tips. And this can often happen when the plants are flowering in late winter, when they're in very high humidity in polytunnels and there's not a lot of flow through the plant, and then the calcium flow can be disrupted, and you start to see these problems, and it's very debilitating to the plant. I mean, stunted growth is another thing you'll see. If a plant hasn't got enough nutrients, it's liable to be smaller than it would be if the nutrition was perfect. And the leaves may also be yellowed and appear slightly distorted. But you'll definitely get a much smaller plant, as you see there on the right. And this is commonly caused by nitrogen and phosphorus. And we saw a picture of the poinsettia earlier where the nitrogen deficient plant was a little bit smaller. And I'll show you a couple of more examples now. If we look on the left picture shows two cyclamen. The one on the left is very small, and that's the nitrogen deficient one. The one on the right is a healthy plant with flowers. So you see the effect of nitrogen, quite dramatic, and that's why it's a major element. And again, on the right, phosphorus, another major element, has a dramatic effect on young plant growth, in forming roots and buds. And we can see the pansies there on the left with the correct nutrition, and then plants grown with low phosphorus, and they've hardly moved. The leaves start to purple. You can't really see it very well on the picture, but they're very small and purple, and you can see the effect of withholding one nutrient. It's really dramatic. So I hope I've given you a bit of a follow through there of the different trace elements and what you might see. There's a lot more information on the individual elements, but I wanted to give you a few keys that you could use to try and help yourself to identify some of the problems. We can always help, of course. If you do want to supply some extra trace elements, it can be done, via most water-soluble fertilizers and controlled release fertilizers. And ideally, you'd have your program set up at the start so that there's enough trace elements supplied within the package. But you can also make single element applications. If you were short of molybdenum, you can apply sodium molybdate, to correct the deficiency. But generally, plants are often generally deficient in quite a few trace elements. So often, using a balanced package of trace elements, all in the right proportions, can be a safer way to achieve that. Because, as you see here with the vitis, boron deficiency on the left, boron toxicity on the right, and there's a narrow band between the two. So if you apply too much, it's just as bad as not applying enough. The trace elements are needed continuously, particularly with things like calcium and iron. You need to supply them right through the crop. But trace element packages are available, to sort these problems out. And we have a couple of products. We have a specialist iron product called Micromax WS Iron, and we have the balance package Micromax TE Mix. And we have a third option of Micromax Premium, where you can incorporate it into the growing media, which gives you a long-term slow release trace element release, which is much easier than having to keep adding trace elements in the feed. Another option, if you're not really sure what the problem is, it looks generally starved. Something like Peter's Professional Foliar feed, which has got a good NPK analysis, but also the trace element availability. This is, a very safe product to use. It has a very low conductivity, so it makes it very unlikely to scorch the leaves, and you'll get very fast nutrient uptake. So this can be a real quick fix if you need to sell plants quickly and dispatch them for sale. This can really green them up. Again, foliar feeds are only, they're a quick fix. They'll green it up. You do need to get to the root of the problem and try and decide what's going on. It might just be old stock you've had left that wasn't sold at the correct time. Just to round off on a few key points. In many cases, it's more practical to treat the cause of the nutritional deficiency, i.e. watering or pH issues, rather than add the deficient nutrient. And obviously, using visual identification can be used as a practical and quick diagnostic tool. Obviously, you send a sample off to the lab, it can take a few days to come back, and then you might need some help looking at the data. Nevertheless, if you do get a deficiency symptom, it is a major drawback, and it has a great effect on the quality, growth, and saleability of the plants. So please try and get the key factors right. Look at your water quality and your growing media, and follow a nutritional plan for the crop you're growing. And your local ICL technical area sales manager can give advice on nutritional plans backed by our Angela Webb nutrition software to give you the best results. Just a couple of slides at the end, just to show you some of the posters that we've produced to demonstrate some of the deficiencies within nursery stock crops. And if you look at the different effects, they can be quite different between different species of nursery stock. If you're looking at iron and you look at hydrangea, if you then look at conifers, you know, the deficiency is completely different. But they're quite good guides to look at. And we have another one for pot and bedding plants. And there's some really good photos on there to show you deficiencies in, you know, in the major elements as well as all the trace elements. And it's a good reference thing to look at. Well, thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.